Yo, YouTube, it's Elliott Hulse here, and in today's video, you can tell it's a little different. I've got a guest, and our guest name is Brendon Marotta. Brendon first became interested in filmmaking. He's a filmmaker at the age of 14. After watching a film critic break down the original Star Wars trilogy shot by shot, in high school he began crewing on low-budget horror films and directed and edited over 30 short video projects. Brendon graduated from the University of North Carolina School of Arts in 2010 with a BFA in film editing and sound, where he worked in every major role on the film set. During his time in film school, Brendon competed in the Virginia Film Festival Adrenaline Film Project, where he won the jury prize in 2013. He completed a year-long Meisner acting program at the Waterfront Playhouse and Conservatory. In 2014, a feature he edited was selected to premiere in the Austin Film Festival and won the Narrative Feature Audience Award. And in 2017, we're up to date here almost, and a part of the big reason why he's here, he finished his first documentary feature as a director and won Best Documentary at the Lone Star Film Festival. So Strength Camp fans, please give a warm welcome to Brendon Marotta. And the reason why I have Brendon joining us here today is to discuss his award-winning new documentary, which we'll talk about in a moment. But the reason why we're doing this here is because you guys asked me a question earlier this year about my thoughts on circumcision. And I made a really explosive video about it, really just sharing my heart and my experience. And I even spoke about how I did not circumcise my son and the reasons why. There was a lot of debate in the comment area, but what was wonderful was a lot of people reached out to me personally. Brendon was one of those people who reached out to me and let me know that he's a filmmaker. He's created a documentary that's coming out all about circumcisions, right? Yep. So you guys asked for it. We're going deep here. And Brendon's new documentary, the award-winning one that we're talking about, is called American Circumcision. Brendon, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. It's a real honor to have your whole bio read by someone you admire. So that's a very warm welcome. I appreciate it.
That's cool, man. You know, I'm always so fascinated in people and the journeys that they go on. And I even like to imagine myself as that person. And while I was reading that, I was like, man, that must have been so cool to be in film and to be an actor and to be an artist. You know, I'm a coach. I'm a strength coach. I teach people how to lift. How did you get into, or what made you actually decide to get into creating documentaries of all things?
So initially, I was just in narrative film. I like you mentioned, I got into it initially because I just had that epiphany when I was seeing a film critic kind of go deeper into a film, that film was a way you could communicate ideas to people. And as a young person, I was really interested in philosophy and spirituality and topics that people don't want to talk to a 14-year-old about. But I realized if you put these ideas in a film, then people would have conversations that they maybe wouldn't normally have in their day-to-day lives. And so that's initially what got me interested in it. And then I was working on like horror stuff and, you know, sort of escapist things initially. And then I learned about the issue of circumcision. And I was so blown away by what I was learning. I felt like I had to communicate this to people in some way. And film is what I love. It's what I do. So that was sort of the natural outlet.
What did you learn about circumcision that made you want to create a documentary on it?
I feel like the thing that initially caught my attention was the fact that this procedure is often done without any anesthesia. And at the time when I learned that, I was doing a lot of internal personal work. I was reading a lot about how early life events affect people later on. So, you know, it's really commonly accepted that trauma early on in life, or like trauma in infancy, has an effect later on in your life. But I was sort of just discovering that and like really getting into it and starting to see ways in which my beliefs and patterns and attitudes had been shaped by early life experiences. So I was learning this on a very basic level, just things like how when a kid is shamed for something, later on in life, it becomes difficult to express that emotion.
Sure.
And then when I learned that this procedure, which involves cutting into the genitals of a child, a newborn infant, is often done without anesthesia. And up until the late 1980s, it was believed by doctors infants didn't even feel pain. So they would just completely ignore the response from that. I thought, well, there's got to be an impact of that in some way. And you can't cause that much pain early in life without there being some impact. So when I learned that, I started researching and finding out everything I could. But initially, you know, when I was just sort of, as I was initially learning about early life stuff, I had some resistance to learning about it. And I suspect a lot of the people you've talked to about this have some resistance to learning about it too, because I just sort of thought, well, there's nothing I can do about that now. You know, I don't like the feeling of not being in control. I don't like things I can't change. I could change my beliefs. I could change my lifestyle and habits, but I didn't really feel like I could change that one. So I initially kind of just pushed it out of mind.
Right.
But at the time, I'm doing shadow work, right? I'm going into the parts of myself that I'm afraid to look at, and I'm doing a lot of meditation. And in meditation, the type that I practice, you're just present with whatever's there. You're not trying to add to it. You're not trying to push anything away. And so during meditation, I had the word circumcision come into my mind. And I just felt this really cold sensation in the body, and I felt like all my energy drained down to my belt. And it happened a couple times during this meditation. I was like, what is this? You know, like, this is really strange. But I figured some part of my consciousness wants me to look at this, right? I don't know why, I don't understand it yet, but some part of me feels like I need to look at this. So that's when I went home and started researching. And one of the first things I found was something called foreskin restoration, which is where people take the remaining skin and stretch it slowly over time. So they have a covering of that part of the body. They don't get all the nerves and function of the foreskin back, but they get some of it back. I thought, that's kind of interesting. I'd always been told there's nothing you can do about this, but clearly there's something you can do about this. So what else have I not been told? And then that's what led to all the research. That's what led to what one of my interview subjects calls the obsessive epiphany, where you realize that there's more to an issue than your culture has told you. You start researching everything about it and reading every book and watching every video. And then that research eventually became the film, because I felt like I had to share this in some way.
Wow. So one of the things you mentioned in the film is that it's the most common surgery in America. And just now you mentioned how it may actually cause post-traumatic stress, would you say? You know, because to cut a baby that actually does feel physically, that will somehow show up later in their life. So it's a prevalent thing. And how is it showing up in our lives?
Yeah, it's hard to quantify that, but the interesting thing is that the most pro-circumcision, because we interview both sides in the film, the most pro-circumcision people who appear in the film will acknowledge that the studies indicating that there is a change in behavior after the pain of circumcision are valid and accurate. So these go back to a series of studies called the Anand and Hickney pain studies. And what they did is they measured the reaction of children to vaccination. So when you put a needle in a child for vaccination, there was this group of children that reacted incredibly dramatically to the pain. They felt the pain much more, they reacted much stronger to it. And so they were trying to figure out, okay, why is one group of kids reacting so strongly to this pain? And they were looking like, was it the kids who were, bottle fed versus breastfed? Was it something about gender? And what they found it was the kids who'd been circumcised who were acting much more dramatically to this pain.
Really?
And the
That's
research
amazing.
Yeah. So, and a change in behavior is a form of memory. So if you when we talk about memory, we usually think about it as what you might call a narrative memory. So if I ask you what you ate for breakfast yesterday, you can tell me a story. But there's also somatic memory, which is memory that's stored in the body. Mm-hmm. You kind of get at this concept when you talk about bioenergetics and things like that. Your body remembers certain things. Mm-hmm. And this is pre-verbal. This is not something you might have a narrative around. It's very similar actually to the kind of memory you see in animals. So if you were to beat your dog, when you raise your fist, the dog will flinch. And if you pet your dog and you're really nice to your dog, when you come home, your dog's excited to see you. But your dog doesn't have narrative memory. Your dog can't tell you what it did the other day, but it has somatic memory. So infants and people, our memories before the age of like 3 or 4 are what we call somatic memories. Those early memories are pre-verbal. And so when you see a change in behavior like that, that's a form of memory. And the researchers behind these studies attribute it to PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So they say they had these really painful experiences at circumcision. And now they're reacting much stronger to pain because they go, oh, pain. I remember what that was. That was really bad. Like I'm now they're not just experiencing the pain of a vaccination, but they're also in some way reminded of or re-experiencing the pain of circumcision.
Wow. It just gave me a memory from when I was a kid. I was circumcised. And of course, I don't remember it here. But what I do remember here was getting vaccinations. And horror. I remember screaming in horror. I don't think there are any other memories from my childhood at that time that I remember that distinctly than my dad holding me over his shoulder and then the doctor sticking me with the pin. And as an adult, I've shut pain out so that I can be a strong man, I can be a bodybuilder. This is what we do. But I think back of like, what a little, how soft was I when I was getting that pin stuck in me that I was crying so much. So it just kind of just sparked something in my mind there. That's incredible.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about when you start dealing with this stuff psychologically is that, like, I don't think it was that you were weak at that time. I think it would, like, you understand because of the work you do that the experiences you have and the ways that you train your body either make you stronger or atrophy and make it weaker. And so I would just say that there might have been something that made you react that strongly. Just as like if you're a parent and you build your kid up, they're going to react stronger to things. So yeah. And the interesting thing too is that if you look at healing work or shadow work, when you get into this stuff, if you're willing to feel it, if you're willing to process it, then you actually can become stronger. Because now that thing which would have made you react so dramatically to something like a vaccination or a pain later in life, you're aware of. And you go, oh, okay, like I know what this is. I don't need, it's not this traumatic memory or this traumatic like feeling in the body that I may not even be aware of. It's this thing that I am aware of and I can make a choice around and I can process as an adult.
So there are a lot of people watching this right now that their minds might be blown, or they may have turned it off already because they're just cognitive dissonance. But for those of us who are still listening, because we're interested in what you have to say and definitely interested in checking out your documentary, what are some of the answers to people who say that it's more hygienic, that it prevents diseases? I mean, there's so many different ways to describe the reasons why they should get vaccinations. Or I'm sorry, I'm thinking about that now. I'm still traumatized. Circumcision, genital, cutting.
So I want to address the resistance first, because I felt that initially when I learned about this issue, right? It's like, that's weird. That makes me uncomfortable. I don't want to learn about it. And I feel like a lot of the responses that people give to this issue are a form of psychological resistance. So if you accept that there might be an issue here, then you have to go into whatever feelings you have around it. And those feelings may not be comfortable. And I would like to just offer that the same way that if you allow yourself to experience some discomfort in the gym, you can get stronger. If you allow yourself to experience whatever emotions you have, you can become emotionally stronger. And so that would be my suggestion there. But on the topic of, all of the reasons that are given for it, when you get into those, first of all, they tend to be like really soundbite reasons, right? Like, it's cleaner. And it's like, okay, what does that mean? Like, I mean, you could cut off your ear and then your ear would be cleaner, but you wouldn't have an ear and all the form and functions of your ear. And also we have soap and water. So, and when you start tracing back these particular reasons given, they have a really interesting origin. So for example, part of the reason that circumcision started in America is that in the late 1800s, prior to then, it had just been a religious custom. But in the late 1800s, Victorian doctors believed that masturbation was the source of many diseases and social ills. And They thought that if you were to remove the most pleasurable part of the penis and the part that is the sliding mechanism that allows someone to rub their skin over top themselves, that you could end this great moral ill of our time. And of course, that didn't work. But that was their thinking at the time, and that was part of the reason that circumcision was initially pushed. And so the meme that it is cleaner and more hygienic, initially, the seeds of that began, not just for it being physically cleaner, but also morally cleaner, morally more hygienic. And I think most people would recoil at that idea now. But at the time, that was sort of how there was a very different perception of sexuality. Now we would say sexuality is wonderful and something to be celebrated, but at the time it was seen as bad and unclean in some way. And so, I mean, you can go through all of these reasons. I mean, you can go into a lot of the science and studies around, disease prevention is not that solid. And when you get into the statistics of it, it's really not very convincing. But most people, they're not reading academic journals, right? They're not going into the studies of circumcision. So they read, that abstract gets pushed by a medical organization that does circumcisions and charges money for them and makes money from them. And then it goes to the press and newspapers, and then it gets even more condensed. And by the time it reaches the public, it's just a little soundbite like that. You don't really know where it came from or why someone would believe that. But on all of them, we wouldn't accept those reasons for cutting off any other part of the body, and we wouldn't accept those reasons for cutting off part of a woman's body. So there is female circumcision, and if someone told you that was cleaner or it prevented disease, you would say, who cares? That violates her bodily autonomy. Like, she has the right to her own body. But we haven't made that argument with men's bodies yet. We haven't said men have the right to their own bodies, or my body, my rights. So there's a very different perception in terms of men's and women's bodies, and also the rights that different groups of people have.
That's interesting. So it's like we treasure our women's bodies more than our own bodies. And in this time, this day and age where men are demonized. I was watching a video just now where a woman had on a shirt that says toxic masculinity and men are evil and things of that nature. But if you just go back to this root pain that we've all experienced, actually society's pretty against men, pretty barbaric towards us.
Yeah, I've heard it said that we make women into sex objects. And we say that their value comes from their beauty and their bodies. But we also make men into success objects. And their value comes from their willingness to sacrifice their own personal pleasure and well-being and comfort for the good of the tribe. And in circumcision is sort of an extreme example of that. It's like your body and pleasure doesn't matter. What matters is the will of the group. And in the case of, there are certain places where I can understand an adult choosing that. Like, I admire people who are willing to sacrifice their comfort and well-being for the good of others. But in the case of children, they are not men yet, and that is not a choice. And the sacrifice is not providing value for their tribe. It is providing value for the person who's making money off that circumcision.
Yeah, it really is. It was interesting in your documentary to have all the experts, the American Pediatric Board.
American Academy of Pediatrics, yes.
Yeah, there were the guys that were providing their stance. One of which was he was Jewish. The guy that was talking about, he even kind of he agreed with the idea that maybe it's not the best idea for everyone, but he was Jewish, so he's like, this is just what we do. It's a part of our tribe. We live in a country that's mostly Christian. I've heard that it's really not a biblical idea. What do you say to Christians who say that, well, I did this to my son, or I had it done because I'm Christian?
So on the topic of Christianity and circumcision is not Christian. The Apostle Paul in Galatians calls it a mutilation. He says that anyone who does this is denying their faith in Christ. And he basically says that circumcision was a blood sacrifice. And now we have Christ who died for us. Christ is the ultimate blood sacrifice. His death covers everyone's sins. And so you don't need to do further sacrifices. And if you're doing further sacrifices, then you're saying that you need something beyond Christ, that Christ wasn't enough for you. So and all of the medieval church, all of the historical church is very clear that they were against circumcision. It was not necessary for Christians. But in America, people are not just Christians, they're Americans. And so they hear it's in the Bible, and they don't actually read what their Bible says on this topic. They just hear that it's in there, and then they do that because it's a cultural thing to do. It would be almost as strange as saying, well, homosexuality is in the Bible, so we should all do that. Like, the context in the text is a little bit different. So that, in terms of Christianity and circumcision is not Christian. But there is a large group of Jewish people and Muslims who feel that circumcision is their religious right. And on that topic, first of all, there's a large group of Jewish people who are against circumcision. There's been questioning of circumcision in the Jewish faith and the Jewish tribe for, as long as circumcision has been practiced. And the argument that Jewish activists make is they say that they have the right to their own body, and that comes before anyone else's belief or religion. So you may have a faith that says you should do this, but you don't have the right to impose your faith on my body. And on the topic of religious rituals when it comes to children, we understand that, for example, Jehovah's Witnesses and groups that think that blood transfusions are bad, they don't have the right to refuse life-saving care to their children. We also understand that Muslims don't have the right to circumcise their daughters. We think that the bodily autonomy of the daughters supersedes the beliefs of the parents. And this is true of the way we treat those kind of rituals in every other faith. I mean, as a Christian, you couldn't tattoo a cross on your child's body, right? But circumcision is a much more invasive procedure than that. And so they make the argument that, I have the right to my body regardless of what my parents believe, and that's more important than the beliefs of the parents.
Yeah, it's funny. I have 3 daughters, and I wouldn't even pierce their ears until they were old enough to give consent.
Right. And yet I think there's a historical and cultural thing here that sort of makes people, shut that information out. And you'll meet people who are very scientific in other areas of their life, who feel that they support human rights for all sorts of different types of groups of people, that everyone has the right to express their sexuality however they want, that consent is really important, that people should have to consent to things that are done to them. And yet on this issue, they sort of go, well, it's the parents' choice, because they have those sort of cultural blinders.
One of the other things that I found really interesting was that outside of Israel-Palestine, the U.S. has the largest number of circumcisions and circumcised men. That's crazy that most of Europe doesn't do it, and really the rest of the world doesn't do it.
Yeah, there has been some in the English-speaking world, just because the prevalence of the English language, it spreads through that. But virtually every other country, even countries that at one time considered it, doesn't practice it anymore. So America is really the only place that is routinely done for non-religious reasons. The Muslim world does it, and Israel and the Jewish world does it. But outside of that, it's really not practiced. There's some African tribes that still practice it, but that's about it. And so I think a lot of Americans assume that this is standard, that this is normal, because it's normal in their culture. And we're not, Americans are not terribly aware of the bodily practices of other cultures. It's not a subject you talk about when you meet someone from a foreign country, right?
I would imagine that's a big part of why it's been undercover for so long, because I think, and this is why I'm willing to do this video with you, and I love your documentary, because I think if more men knew that, hey, there's a piece of your penis that's missing,
right,
and it wasn't consented, and which I would love if you could go into a little bit more, this part of the penis that was cut off is actually the most highly sensitive and erogenous tissue in your entire body. This is where male orgasm is really meant to originate and happen, not at the prostate.
Yeah, there is, there's a lot I could talk about there. Most men are just not aware of this knowledge. So if you think about how much you knew about sex when you were a kid, you probably had all sorts of misconceptions, right? Sure. But as you get older, those misconceptions get dispelled 2 different ways. Either someone tells you new information, or you have personal experience that reveals something new to you. And most people don't have a personal experience with this part of the body, especially if they're men, especially if they're straight men. And most of the wider culture is not that informed on it and won't tell you. So that these misconceptions never get changed. And if you look at, there's actually done studies on men's satisfaction or more their beliefs about circumcision, and the less that they, you know, the last men, like, how many square inches of tissue do you think the foreskin is? And if they say it's like 1 square inch, they're very happy with circumcision. They see no problem with it. If they think it's 5 square inches, they think they're a little less happy. But the actual number is around like 12 to 15 square inches, maybe more.
That's amazing. 12 to 15 square inches of tissue.
Well, if you think about it, it's 2 sides, right? So if you fold it out, there's tissue on each side, and it's different tissue on each side.
Mm-hmm.
So the tissue of the foreskin, I mean, you can actually do a sensitivity test on yourself.
Mm-hmm.
The inside of tissue of the foreskin is considered the most erogenous tissue on a man's body. And if you know where the circumcision scar is on your body, if you run your finger along the tissue above that, it's
right.
probably much more sensitive than the tissue below. So you can actually see on your body, like, oh, that's what the sensitivity of the foreskin would have been.
Mm-hmm.
But the really the most erogenous is the ridged band of the foreskin. And if you think about it, we have really intense nerve endings on all the openings of the body. So like your lips have very erogenous tissue. That's why when you kiss someone, it feels really good. So, and then you think about it, it makes sense for the body. You need to know if something's entering your body, right? That's just sort of, as a biological function, makes sense. But the tissue of the foreskin contains lots of what are known as Meissner's corpuscles. It's really fine nerve endings. And you have these in the palm of your hand. So if you run your fingers across the palm of your hand, it's much more sensitive than the back of your hand. And the interesting thing about these nerve endings is that the lighter you touch, the more sensitive it is.
Yeah.
So when you talk about sensitivity too, there are men who will say, well, I feel fine. I feel, I can sense what's going on there. But I think for a lot of men, it's not that like level of erogenous tissue where you have that like really fine touch sensation. So the sensation might be there, but it is different than it would have been had you had those, additional nerve endings.
Right.
And the other thing too is people think about the foreskin. I mean, we create this word called the foreskin that it sort of divides the penis into 2 parts. There's not like there's a dotted line on men that says like cut here when they're born, right? The tissue of the foreskin actually has different parts. So the frenulum, which is the like underside of the mushroom head of the penis, if you will, is different tissue than at the ridge band, and is different tissue than is at the inside of the foreskin. So you think about women's bodies, women can have lots of different types of orgasms, right? The clitoral orgasm and the G-spot orgasm are 2 different types of orgasms.
Right.
And men are actually designed to have the same thing too, but we have those additional parts removed. And if you were to remove the clitoris of a woman, or at least the external part of it, I mean, she can still have a G-spot orgasm, right? But we wouldn't say that she has having the full sexual experience of being a woman. There is something that a clitoral orgasm provides that's different. So I think when men think about their sexuality, they think like, well, it feels good on my penis when it goes in, right? They don't realize there's this range of sensation that would be
a whole lot.
Yeah.
It was fascinating to have that one expert, the sex expert on your documentary, talk about how sex changes, the mechanics of sex changes, because instead of, we're thrusting in and out here because, that's where we get the good feelings, and the orgasm happens at the prostate. But really with the foreskin, it's more of a shallow approach to having sex.
Right. I think you mean the head of the penis, right? That's where you're talking about.
Well, for a circumcised man, yeah. In other words, a woman without a G-spot, without a clitoris, would have a G-spot.
Right.
So a man would have both, but instead we don't have the clitoris part.
Right. So we have there's an orgasm from, sometimes the remaining frenulum still has some, and it sort of depends on the man. That's the other thing. These are not standard. So we also talk in the film about, botches. Like it's not like there is a standard cut line. So some men are going to have different experiences compared to others.
I know a few young men that have told me that they've been botched. Like that's Crazy.
It's way more common than people want to admit. It's like when I talked to the president of the Virginia Urological Association, the former president, he told me that at his practice, he sees maybe 10% boys who've had a botch of some kind, which, you know, 1 in 10 men, right? That's huge, especially when you think about the number of men this has been done to.
Mm.
Yeah. And they're really common when you know how to spot them. But one of the other things that changes, and this is actually something that restoration can get back, is the gliding mechanism of the foreskin. So the penis is meant to have moving parts. And right now what we have is just, you know, if you're circumcised, you just have a rod. But it's actually, there's meant to be this foreskin that it glides in and out of. And that gliding mechanism allows the penis to stimulate itself. So the inside of the foreskin is rubbing against the glands of the penis. And without that, you know, and you can get stimulation from these sort of short strokes.
Right.
Without that, you have to go a little harder,
right,
and a little longer, because you're not getting, you know, 2 layers stimulated at once. This layer has now been folded down here. And so you have to get friction as stimulation rather than gliding. And that changes the mechanics of sex because you have to do those longer strokes. And so you're not in the woman as much. You have to pull yourself away from her a little more
right,
and come back in. And like, we don't, again, like when people, our sex education on the penis is years behind what women know about their bodies, because we just sort of think it goes in and out and it feels good.
sure.
We don't realize that there is this whole, you know, process that has been removed.
So you mentioned restoration. Is this a means by which men are growing back their foreskin?
Sort of. So there's like I mentioned, there's specialized nerve endings in the penis that you can't, or in the foreskin that you can't get back. So the ridged band, which is at the end of the foreskin and has the most nerve endings, is not something that you can restore through restoration. But what you can do is take the remaining skin and stretch it over time. It's kind of like how when people put a gauge in their ear, their earlobe becomes bigger. It's the same principle that when actually, it's also the same principle as working out. Like when you use your muscles, they have to grow back bigger. And so what men will do is they will apply gentle tension to the remaining foreskin that they have, and over time get a covering again. And that covers the glands of the penis, that allows it to become mucosal again. So when your penis is rubbing against whatever underwear you have, it becomes dried out. This will make it softer and more sensitive because it has a covering again, and you get the gliding mechanism back. Now, this doesn't get everything back, and this process can take like 5 or 6 years. Because again, you're stretching really slowly over time.
Yeah.
And like, how long would it take you to put a gauge in your ear and get your ear down to here? Like, that's a long process.
Yeah, you're committed.
Yeah, but there are, I mean, by the estimate of one of the people who makes restoration devices in my film, there are 250,000 men doing this in the United States. And again, like, you know, this guy who I interview in my film, he supports his family of 4 just making devices for men to do this. So yeah. There is a demand for it. There's a lot more men who are wanting to change this than I think most people realize. Because we're men, we don't talk about this stuff very publicly, right?
Yeah, except for me and you.
Right, yeah. Well, in our case, like, you have to have a certain level of comfort in yourself to talk about it, right? You have, like, I did not talk about this openly initially. It took me a while to get to this point. And I think that's the case for most men. There's also some efforts to use regenerative medicine to regrow this part of the body. So there's an idea that using stem cells, you can regrow this. And that's currently not possible. It is something that there is a research group called 4Gen that is working on. But again, like, you know, we actually use regenerative medicine to grow back people's fingers that have been cut off. They've used it to regrow the inside of a woman's vagina. Wow. So it seems possible to regrow this. But again, it requires enough men saying they want this and enough people with money contributing it towards this idea. But right now, it's at least, 5 to 10 years out on that technology.
Yeah. it's only conceptual what we're missing, because we've had this injury since we were babies and we started having sex, many, many, many years later. So it's not like we have a frame of reference for like what we've missed, which is kind of a blessing. So it's not like, we're out there missing something that we once had. But I would just offer that I guess the best thing that we can do is be aware, of course, but not to subject the next generation to it, not
right.
to our sons out of pure ignorance. I mean, you can't watch this or watch your documentary and be exposed to the truth, see the light, and then still continue to practice darkness.
Yeah, I think when people see the procedure, they have a change in perspective on it. And I've had a lot of activists tell me that just watching the procedure for the first time is what made them see this differently. And I'd also say too that if you're willing to explore the issue, I actually think it can help you where you are now. Like, I have a greater awareness of my body and the sensations that I have because I know what parts of the body they're coming from.
Right.
And I have a greater awareness of my own feelings and emotions and how I process things because I'm willing to feel those emotions. So I actually think that it is important to do, obviously, for the next generation, but there is a benefit to being willing to look at and feel the things that you actually feel and the things that have happened to you in this life, in the current day.
Wow. So I'd like to ask a little bit about your filmmaking experience. So to put this documentary together, you really brought together some incredible experts. The guy from Australia who was gung-ho for nail cutting. And then also I was really impressed with Marilyn Milos, the nurse, that really, I think she's the one that sparked this movement in America. I'd love to know more about these awesome people and how you came across them.
Yeah, Marilyn has a very big heart. So basically, when I was doing research on this, I initially when I decided we had to make this film, I called up everyone whose book I'd read, whose website I'd seen, and I said, I'm going to be in your town during these dates. I'd love to interview you. Is there time we could do that? And what people would do is they'd say, oh yes, and while you're here, who else you should talk to? They'd start recommending other people. And they would often be people who were a little bit off the grid, whose stories I might not have heard otherwise. And so I just went through, all of the top experts I'd heard of and contacted them and said, I want to interview you. And I worked on this film over the course of 6 years. So we had time to get to all the sort of major experts and just went down the list. And so we have people from the American Academy of Pediatrics, one of the largest circumcision organizations or organizations. They don't officially recommend it, but they currently say the benefits outweigh the risks. And so we talked to them, we talked to doctors who do the procedure, we talked to people from Doctors Opposing Circumcision and, founders of what is now called the intactivist movement. So intact plus activist is where that name comes from. Activist for the intact body, for keeping men intact and whole. And, everyone we could. I mean, there would be certain studies I'd read and I'd try to contact the authors of those studies and get them on camera. Yeah. And Marilyn is really interesting. Marilyn was a nurse in the 70s, I believe, and she saw the procedure done. And when she was training to become a nurse and broke down crying, because she's a very empathetic person. And so seeing this child crying out in pain as this doctor is doing this had a huge impact on her. And the doctor turned to her who was doing the procedure and said, there's no medical reason for doing this. And she was like, well, why are we doing it then? And so she started educating parents. She said, well, I'm a nurse. One of my jobs is to give informed consent. In medicine, you're expected to tell the patient anything a reasonable person would want to know about a procedure before you do it. Yeah. So if you're getting surgery of some kind, the doctor needs to tell you, these are the potential risks. This is what could go wrong. Here's the potential outcome. Here's why we should do it. And on circumcision, doctors will just say, would you like your child circumcised? And that's it. They won't add anything else. They won't give, they won't share any information in my documentary. They won't share that there's a potential for botches or for something going wrong. They won't share that, he is an adult, might disagree with the decision you made and come back to you and have a conversation about it. They won't talk about the sexual impact. They won't talk about the fact that often it is not done with pain medication.
Trauma.
None of that. Yeah, they don't, none of that. It's just, would you like it done? So Marilyn started actually giving informed consent to parents, and the hospital fired her for it. They said, you're causing a lot of trouble. We don't like that. You're done. And so that's when she became an activist and started talking to people in a new way, realizing, okay, this is an institutional problem. This is not just parents not knowing the information. This is something going on in the medical community and in the wider culture. And from her work, she has brought together a lot of interesting different people. And what's interesting now is that when people come to the issue, when people start doing activism on it, they've never heard of her. It's like gone beyond her initial work. They're like, Marilyn who? They don't realize, this is like, and there were other people before her, but she was sort of the one who said, this needs to be a movement. This needs to be something that people will take charge of. And I think it really hit her too, because she'd had 3 sons, and the doctor told her they're not going to feel anything. It's totally fine. It's totally normal. And so she'd done that. And so there's, I think, a part of her that feels a lot of pain and empathy for her children, and extends that not just to what happened to her and what happened to her kids, but to wanting to take care of and protect everyone's kids.
It was amazing to see that one woman who was enlightened to what circumcision was and what happened to her son, and the fact that she allowed it to happen without any resistance, and how torn up, how broken she felt. It was so obvious through the film, like she was remorseful, regretful, sorry. Just as pain for the parent to find out as the child.
Yeah, there's a whole community of what's called regret parents, of parents who just didn't know and now have some really strong feelings about it. And I think when people present this issue in the larger culture, they just sort of present it as this one-time decision that the parents make and that you never have to think about again.
Right.
And what we do in the film is we look at it more like a stone being thrown in water. Yeah. And this one decision ripples out into the child's life, into his relationship with his parents and the feelings of parents. It ripples out into his sexuality, his identity, his psychology, his culture, into medical institutions, into legal institutions, into religious institutions. We look at this as this really small one-time decision. Yeah. You can't change a part of someone's body and not have it affect the whole of them. We are, as one of my interview subjects says, we are not just skin. Yeah. We're human beings, and we have feelings about our bodies. And when you change something about someone's body, they have feelings about it.
Yeah. And I love what you mentioned earlier about the trauma that happens before age 4 gets trapped intrinsically. It becomes a part of the unconscious, and it carries through the rest of your life. And one of the people in your documentary that I really enjoyed watching him, because he was so angry. The one young man who discovered what happened and then confronted his mom, and his mom told him, well, you're my baby, I can do whatever I want. This kid was enraged at delivering this.
Yeah, when people frame this as a parenting decision, like, well, it's the parent's choice, I don't think they think about the fact that their kid might have a conversation about their parenting decisions later. That their kid, which one of the people in our film does at 14 or 15, might come to them and say, hey, you cut off a part of my body that I want. Yeah. And they don't think of it as like, this could be a relationship ending decision. And there are people I've talked to who said when they learned about this and they talked to their parents about it, like that was it. Their parents' reaction was not something they were okay with, and then they were out of their life. So, I mean, even if you were to accept the frame that this is a choice that parents can make, it is not a choice that is always going to go well with your child when he's an adult. And I think people also, they make that decision based on not just where the culture is now, but where the culture was when they were kids. They say, well, everyone I knew growing up was circumcised. It's like, well, the circumcision rate now is around 50% and heading downward, which means that when your kid is an adult, they're going to be the one who's different. Right. And so if half their friends still have this part of the body and they don't, then they're going to ask questions about it. And if you think about how much our culture has changed around other issues, around things like sexual freedom, around personal autonomy, in the past 18 years, I mean, if you can imagine 18 years ago, the first George W. Bush was president, right? That's how much the culture has changed, and all the attitudes of the moral majority then, and Look at how much it's changed in 18 years. How much do you think it's going to change in 18 more years? I don't think any of us could predict that. I don't think anyone can predict where our culture is going to be 5 years from now, much less 18. So your child may have a very different relationship to this issue than you did growing up, than you do now, and than you might in the future.
You know, previous generations, I think, can be forgiven because information was not available. So,
Right.
you know, with my parents, like my mother came from another country. She came from Belize. She came here and she went to nursing school. And so, of course, that's pure indoctrination right from the start. She didn't know anything else besides what they tell her. There's no internet. And so, yeah, of course, go right ahead. But I would imagine that for a person to be alive today, where there's ability to research absolutely anything that you plan on doing before you do it is there, that a parent who is found out later on, you know, their kids discover that you didn't research, you didn't look into it, you didn't Google what this was all about, you didn't think about it. Do you not love me enough to just look a little bit?
Right.
Heartbreaking and terrifying.
Yeah. When my parents were having me, you know, in the late 80s, I mean, the information they had, like you said, there was no internet. The information they got was from their doctor, who, as I was told, basically like bullied them into it, said, "You're an idiot if you don't do this," because of course they're getting paid for it. And especially in hospitals in the 80s, they often didn't even have a consent form for circumcision. You'd go and you'd sign a blanket consent form that said the hospital gets to do whatever they think is best.
Yeah.
And it actually wasn't until the late 80s, early 90s that hospitals started having to get specific consent for circumcision. And it was interesting, it was because of a Jewish couple. A Jewish couple went in and they wanted to have a ritual circumcision in Judaism for their child, and the hospital did it before they could. And so it was a Jewish couple wanting to circumcise their child that made it so that now hospitals have to ask for consent. But at the time, you know, if your parents wanted to learn something about this, they'd go to their doctor, who would of course tell them to do it because he was making money on it, and they would talk to their peers, who were probably all circumcised as well. Right. And the most that they might be able to do would be go to the library and read historical texts or academic journals on it, which, I mean, that's a lot to ask of people who are already super busy because they're having a kid.
Yeah.
Now, parents are asked consent, do you want your child circumcised? And the first thing they do is they pull up the internet and they search circumcision.
Yeah.
And there's a whole host of information out there. Or they post about it on social media, and people who are involved in this issue immediately start jumping in the comments and providing information. So now there's a very different thing. I think part of the reason the rate is going down is that people have greater access to information. And not just this, but a whole host of issues where institutional things were going on a very long-term basis are now coming to light because we have the ability to talk about them and talk with each other about them, rather than just getting our information from a centralized authority who might have economic interests in not giving us the full picture.
It's amazing. We really do live in the age of light. Like, we're waking up to so much that has been in the dark for so long. I just want to acknowledge you for being a carrier of the light, you know, the work that you've done to bring these experts together to film it. And it's a beautiful film. I mean, you did an incredible job.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
It really is I would say, a spark of light out there that's going to change people's minds, change their lives, change their decisions, and change the American culture, change the culture of the world.
I appreciate that. I've always felt like working on this, that there was something that wanted to come through into the larger culture, and I'm just here. I mean, even the film itself is other people speaking, and it's the collected work of 30 years of activist groups and academic research and cultural change work. So I really appreciate that. Thank you. But there is a part of me that feels like I'm just the thing, the message is coming through. You know, I'm happy to reflect the light, but I don't think I'm the source of it.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. So right now, the documentary is available on Amazon?
It is available on Amazon, iTunes, Vimeo, everywhere that you can get movies. So if you go to circumcisionmovie.com, There's a whole list of places. You can even walk into Best Buy or Walmart and ask them special order.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Very good. And I want to invite everybody who's watching this video to absolutely, I'll put a link down below, but absolutely watch this and share it. I happen to believe that this is a super, super, super fundamental importance for the empowerment of men. I have really taken this past year or so and found my calling, which is to help men become great again, become the strongest version of ourselves. I've been doing it for a long time, but it's getting clearer. And I cannot move any further beyond the fundamental wound that we experience, American men in particular, as babies. We could talk till the cows come home. We could think about things. We can be activists. You can do so many things, but until we stop the core wound, the trauma that we're inflicting upon our boys, men will continue to suffer. And as men suffer, women and society suffer. So definitely go out there or go right down below, click the link, check it out. Brendon, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for doing all the work that you're doing in the world right now, bro.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Is there anything that you want to share before we part ways in terms of, I know you were which was great about the documentary is you really didn't take any sides. You get both sides of the story. Coming from your experience with these experts and your experience as a man, just any parting words as it relates to circumcision and what our viewers should be thinking about?
I feel like the central conflict in the film is between people who are really willing to feel their feelings around this issue and people who aren't.
Wow.
And my hope for anyone watching it is that it would give them the information that they need and the perspectives that they need to really understand their own perspective. So part of the reason I don't have any point in the film where I tell the audience this is what you should believe or this is what you should think, is I want you to get in touch with your own feelings. So that's my hope for people watching.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Thank you for joining us, and see you guys next time.